For many years, the kingdom of Duro had been a place of peace. Its wide plains shimmered with harvest gold, and its rivers carried laughter as much as water. Merchants came from distant lands, drawn by the promise of fairness that King Duro's rule offered. He was not the richest of kings, but his people loved him deeply because his throne was built not on gold, but on compassion. Among all the faces that surrounded him in the palace, there was one that had remained constant since the king's youth, Toba. The boy who had once swept the palace floors had grown into a loyal servant whose kindness touched everyone who met him. He was honest to a fault, gentle in speech, and known to treat even the lowest stable boy with respect. To King Duro, he was not just a servant. He was a reminder that loyalty could be stronger than blood. The king often said, "If every man in my kingdom had Toba's heart, no wall could fall and no enemy could win." Those words carried warmth across the palace halls and filled Toba's simple life with quiet pride. But peace, like sunlight, never lasts without shadow. One morning, the court gathered to welcome a new noble, Lord Kenu, a man whose reputation had arrived before him. He was tall, graceful, and known for his cleverness. His garments shimmered with gold-threaded cloth, and his tongue was sharper than his sword. Yet behind his perfect smile hid the restless ambition of a man who could not stand being unseen. The king welcomed him warmly, offering a seat among his advisors, and Toba, ever humble, bowed deeply before him. "An honor, my lord," he said. But Kenu barely nodded. His eyes moved past Toba to the king, who laughed and placed a hand on the servant's shoulder as if to say, "You are my own." And in that very moment, something dark and unspoken stirred inside Kenu's heart. He saw not a servant, but a rival for the king's affection, a man of no title who stood closer to the throne than he ever could. The days that followed painted a quiet war within Kenu's thoughts. He watched how the king smiled when Toba entered the room, how Toba's advice was heard before his own. To him, it felt like humiliation dressed as kindness. Late at night, while others slept, Kenu would stand by his window overlooking the moonlit palace gardens and whisper to himself, "A servant loved like a son? Then what am I, a shadow? Envy, like poison, does not rush. It seeps." Slowly, it replaced admiration with hatred. His compliments to Toba turned hollow. His laughter became a mask. He began to notice the weaknesses of the palace, the trusting guards, the easy access to the kitchen, the simplicity of the king's daily routine. Every man, he thought, has a weakness. Even a king. Even a servant. And one evening, as the drums of celebration echoed across the palace courtyard, Kenu's eyes gleamed with a thought so dark that even the night seemed to recoil. He waited until the perfect moment, when the king was preparing for a grand feast to celebrate the end of the harvest. That evening, Kenu walked through the palace with calm elegance, greeting everyone as though his heart held no malice. He even exchanged polite words with Toba, who smiled and offered him a small clay cup of palm wine. "To the king," Toba said warmly. To the king, Kenu replied, his voice smooth but hollow inside. As he turned away, the smile faded from his face. He had made his decision. That night, he would begin the plan that would stain the palace with suspicion and heartbreak. And while the kingdom slept under a sky of 1,000 stars, Lord Kenu sat in his chamber, staring at the reflection of his own eyes in a bowl of wine, seeing, for the first time, the enemy he was about to become. The kingdom of Duro remained quiet that night, unaware that the peace it had known for generations was about to break. The guards joked near the gates, the palace musicians practiced soft tunes, and in his chamber, King Duro prayed for his people. But somewhere in the shadowed corridors, ambition took its first breath. Kenu called 2 of the lower guards, offered them more gold than they had ever seen, and whispered his venomous plan. They hesitated, trembling before him, yet the shine of the gold dimmed their conscience. "Tomorrow," he said, "the king will dine as usual, but his trust will die with him. And when suspicion falls, it will fall upon the one closest to him." The guards exchanged nervous glances, but greed won. Outside, Toba was cleaning the dining hall, humming softly to himself, unaware that the same hall would soon witness his fall from grace. The moon climbed high above the palace, and its pale light touched the walls that had once stood for honesty. In that light, unseen by the sleeping kingdom, envy planted its seed. And by the next sunrise, the bond between a king and his most loyal servant would begin to unravel. The moon had barely set when the first signs of dawn kissed the palace walls. The birds sang as if nothing in the world could go wrong. Yet within those golden walls, something wicked had already begun to breathe. The two guards Kinu had bribed the night before moved like shadows through the kitchen corridor. Their hands shook as they poured the king's favorite stew into a bronze pot, glancing nervously at the door every few seconds. From a hidden pouch, one of them took a small vial of cloudy liquid, deadly but colorless, and poured just a few drops into the food. It won't kill him immediately, Kinu had said the night before, but it will weaken him. When the court season collapses, they will ask who served the food, and all fingers will point to the loyal servant. The guards finished their task and hid the vial beneath the kitchen stones before anyone could notice. Outside, the sun broke through the horizon, painting the sky in orange fire, but inside the palace, the first layer of betrayal was already set. Toba, unaware of the dark plot, entered the kitchen that morning with his usual smile. He greeted the cooks, carried trays, and checked that every dish was prepared perfectly for the king's breakfast. He had served the royal meals for years, and every grain of spice he sprinkled carried his devotion. The kitchen bustled with noise, pans clattering, servants whispering, but beneath that ordinary sound lay the silent heartbeat of treachery. When the king's breakfast tray was ready, Toba lifted it with both hands, balanced and careful as always. "Make sure everything is warm," he said softly to a cook who nodded nervously. As Toba stepped out into the golden corridors, he never noticed the faint trail of fear in the room behind him. The guards exchanged glances, guilt pressing heavy on their chests, but greed had already chained their tongues. The scent of roasted herbs filled the hall as Toba made his way toward the king's chamber, his heart light, his mind clear, and his soul unprepared for the storm waiting to strike. King Duro sat by the open window when Toba arrived, sunlight falling on his shoulders. "Ah, my faithful one," the king said, smiling weakly. "Even the morning looks better when you bring it to me." Toba placed the tray gently before him, bowing as he always did. "May the day bring you strength, my king," he said. The king began eating while his advisors discussed matters of trade and border disputes. Kinu stood quietly at the far end of the room, watching. His eyes followed every spoonful the king lifted to his lips, and when the king smiled after the first bite, Kinu's lips curved in a faint, almost invisible smirk. Moments later, a sudden silence fell across the room. The king's hand trembled. His face grew pale, and before anyone could react, he gasped and clutched his chest. "Your Majesty!" Toba shouted, running forward. The room erupted in panic. Advisors rushed, servants screamed, and guards surrounded the throne. The king collapsed onto the floor, struggling for breath. Kinu was the first to kneel beside him, calling for the palace healer with dramatic urgency. "Quick! The king is poisoned," he cried. The words pierced the air like arrows. The accusation had been spoken, and it would not fade. In the confusion, Toba froze, his mind blank. Poison? How? He looked down at the bowl, still half full, steam fading into the cold air. His hands trembled as fear crawled up his spine. The guards looked at him suspiciously, and one shouted, "He served the meal." Another echoed, "It was his duty today." Whispers turned into shouting. Faces that had always smiled at him now glared with disgust and horror. Kinu turned toward the guards, eyes wide in feigned disbelief. "No, it cannot be," he said, pretending pain in his voice. "But it was Toba who served the king this morning, was it not?" The guards nodded hesitantly. Kinu placed a hand over his heart. "I always warn the king. Trust blinds even the wisest men." Toba stepped back, his voice breaking. "No, I would never harm him. You all know me." But no one moved to defend him. The king lay on the floor, barely conscious, and the echo of betrayal hung in the air like smoke. For the first time in his life, Toba felt what it was to be completely alone. By evening, the king's condition had stabilized slightly, though his heart ached more from grief than sickness. He asked to see Toba alone in his chamber. The guards brought him in, chains around his wrists, though no order had been given to bind him. Toba fell to his knees, tears blurring his vision. "My king, I swear upon my life, I have never touched poison. I would rather die than betray you." The king looked at him, pain swimming in his eyes. "Toba," he said weakly, "I want to believe you. My heart does. But my eyes saw no one else near me." Silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, the king said, "I will not punish you yet. You have served me since you were a child, and I owe you that mercy. You have 3 days to prove your innocence. If by the third sunrise you bring me no truth, you will leave this palace forever." The words fell like stones. Toba bowed his head, tears spilling onto the marble floor. "I will not fail you, my king," he whispered. As he was led away, Kinu watched from the shadows, his smile faint but triumphant. In that quiet moment, while the torches flickered across the grand halls, Toba's world shattered, not from punishment, but from disbelief. He had given everything to a world that suddenly turned its back on him, and yet deep in his heart, he knew one truth remained untouched. The innocent must rise, even when the world refuses to see the light. Night fell heavy over the kingdom of Duro, and for the first time in his life, Toba felt the cold bite of loneliness. The same palace that had once been his home now felt like a prison without walls. The guard had released him at sunset, just as the king had ordered, but he walked out with nothing. No coin, no name, only the weight of a false accusation pressing down on his chest. The streets outside the palace were silent. Even the wind seemed to whisper of his disgrace. He wandered until he reached the edge of the royal forest, where the trees stood tall like silent witnesses of his pain. Beneath their ancient branches, Toba sank to his knees and lifted his face toward the dimly glowing moon. "My king," he whispered, "I will not let lies win. I will prove that my heart is true." The night answered him with nothing but the rustle of leaves. He sat there until dawn, his thoughts a storm of fear and resolve. When the first light touched the sky, he rose, dusted the dirt from his clothes, and walked back toward the palace walls, not as a servant, but as a man with a purpose. The palace guards looked at him with suspicion when he returned the next morning, yet none dared to stop him. The king's decree allowed him 3 days, and the first had already begun. He went straight to the kitchen, the very place where his fate had turned against him. The cooks avoided his eyes. Some pretended to be busy, others simply slipped away. But Toba noticed every nervous glance, every whispered word that died when he entered. He began searching quietly, checking the spice racks, the floor corners, the cracks in the stone. Hours passed before his gaze fell upon a loose brick under the cooking table. He knelt down, pried it open, and found what he had not dared to hope for, a small, empty vial, its glass still carrying the faint scent of bitter herbs. His hands trembled as he lifted it. It was the same kind of vial the royal healers used, but what struck him most was the seal on its cork, an insignia carved with the letter K. For a long moment, Toba just stared at it, unable to breathe. "This," he whispered, "is the voice of truth." But truth, he knew, was only a whisper until proven. He wrapped the vial in a cloth and hid it inside his robe. He could not take it to the king yet, not without witnesses, not without more proof. So he continued searching, following the faint trail of deceit left behind by greed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Toba left the kitchen and went out to the servant quarters. He found a young cook named Yona sitting by the well, his face pale with guilt. "Yona," Toba said softly, "you've known me since we were boys. Look at me and tell me if you truly believe I could poison the king." The young man's eyes filled with tears. "No, Toba, I don't," he whispered, "but they told us to stay silent." Toba knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder. "Who told you?" Yona hesitated, glancing around. "Lord Kinu came to the kitchen that night. He said the king wanted the dishes prepared early and gave orders that no one was to enter after him. I didn't see what he did, but when I came back, he looked afraid. He made us promise not to speak." The words hit Toba like a gust of fire. It was the confirmation he needed, yet it was also dangerous knowledge. "Thank you, brother," Toba said, rising. "You've done more for me than you know." He looked up toward the palace towers, where Kinu's chamber light still burned. The night sky was wide and merciless, but Toba felt something in his chest awaken, a quiet flame of justice. "The liar hides behind the crown," he murmured, "but the truth walks without fear." That night, while the palace slept, Toba slipped into the storage cellar beneath the main hall. He carried only a small lantern and his courage. The air was cold and smelled of earth and old wine. He searched the dusty shelves one by one, remembering every sound he had heard that day. The clink of jars, the nervous whispers. Then, behind a stack of grain sacks, he found a wooden chest marked with the royal emblem. Inside were several vials of herbs and oils, neatly arranged, but one stood out. Its seal was cracked and bore the same engraving he had seen earlier. His heartbeat quickened. He examined it closely and noticed something more, the faint traces of the same cloudy residue he had smelled in the kitchen. The poison had come from here. He also found a folded parchment tucked beneath the bottles, a list of supplies signed by none other than Lord Kinu himself. It was all there, The ingredients, the quantities, the dates. The realization hit him like thunder. Kinu had not only planned the poisoning but had ordered the very materials that made it possible. For the first time in days, Toba's despair turned into strength. He knew what he had to do now. Before dawn, Toba left the cellar and walked toward the stables, where a few loyal guards still recognized his kindness. One of them, a veteran named Barrow, had served the king even longer than Toba. "You shouldn't be here," Barrow whispered, glancing around. "Kinu's men will throw you in the dungeon if they see you." Toba took the vial and the parchment from his robe, showing them under the flickering lantern light. "If I fail to bring this to the king, the whole kingdom will live under lies. You were there the day he made me promise to protect him, even from shadows. Help me, Barrow." The old guard stared at the evidence, his jaw tightening. "By the gods," he muttered. "I always knew that snake would bite one day." He nodded once. "Go to the king at sunrise. I'll clear the way." Toba bowed, gratitude heavy in his eyes. He hid the items safely and waited for morning, his heart pounding with both fear and hope. When the first golden light spilled across the palace walls, he rose and whispered to himself, "Today, the truth walks into the throne room." And with steady steps, he set out toward the place that had once called him son, ready to face the court, the king, and the serpent who would betray them all. The palace awoke to a morning heavy with silence, the kind that seemed to hold its breath before a storm. As the sun rose over the golden rooftops, the grand court assembled once again inside the king's hall. The banners fluttered gently, the air thick with whispers and unease. Kinu stood near the throne, dressed in fine silk, his expression calm, almost noble, as if the past few days had left no mark upon his conscience. Around him, nobles and guards exchanged uncertain glances, their faith in truth shaken by rumors and fear. "The servant has not returned," Kinu announced, his voice smooth and confident, echoing through the marble chamber. "The silence of guilt speaks louder than any confession." The courtiers murmured in agreement, nodding hesitantly as if his words were law. King Duro, still pale from his illness, leaned weakly on his throne, his eyes dim with disappointment. "I prayed he would come," he said softly. "But perhaps even the truest heart bends under shame." Kinu stepped closer to the throne, lowering his head in feigned sorrow. "Your Majesty, mercy is a noble virtue, but so is wisdom. The kingdom must see justice. The one who betrayed you cannot be allowed to live under your forgiveness." Just as he finished speaking, the great doors of the hall burst open with a loud echoing thud. The sound startled everyone. All heads turned toward the entrance, where Toba stood, covered in dust, his robe torn, his eyes blazing with a mixture of exhaustion and unshakable resolve. For a moment, the hall fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause outside. "You prayed I would come, my king," Toba said, his voice steady despite the days of suffering. "And so I have come with truth." The court froze in astonishment as Toba walked forward, each step echoing on a marble floor like the toll of judgment. The king's eyes widened in disbelief, a glimmer of life returning to his weary face. "Toba," he whispered, "you returned." Toba stopped before the throne and bowed deeply. "I could never abandon the one who gave me a name, nor let lies destroy the hands that fed me." He reached into his robe and placed a small wooden box on the floor. With trembling fingers, he opened it, revealing the vial, the parchment, and the seal, each one carrying the mark of Lord Kinu. "These," Toba said firmly, "are the pieces of a truth hidden in your own palace. The poison that touched your lips was not born at my hands. It came from one who stood beside you in false loyalty." Gasps filled the hall. The king leaned forward, his voice a whisper of both fear and hope. "Ooh." The word fell like a spark into silence. Toba lifted the parchment high, the seal glinting in the morning light. "This signature belongs to Lord Kinu. He purchased these herbs, hid the poison in the kitchen, and bribed the guards to turn their eyes away." Murmurs spread like wildfire across the chamber. Faces turned toward Kinu, whose calm mask began to crack. "Lies," he shouted suddenly, his voice breaking with panic. "This is nothing but a trick. He forged these to save himself." But before he could speak further, the guard Barrow stepped forward from the crowd. "My king," Barrow said solemnly, "I saw the evidence myself. The vial was hidden beneath the kitchen stone, sealed with Kinu's mark. And the cook Yona confessed that he entered the kitchen that night." Kinu's face drained of color as the circle around him tightened. His words faltered, his eyes darting wildly between the guards and the king. "You would take the word of a servant over mine? he barked, but no one answered. The silence itself had become a verdict. King Duro rose slowly from his throne, his body trembling but his voice regaining its old power. "Enough," he said, and the sound echoed like thunder through the hall. "I have listened to lies long enough. I have seen deceit wrapped in silk and truth clothed in rags." He stepped down the dais, his gaze burning into Kinu's soul. "You poisoned not only my body, but the peace of this kingdom. You turned brother against brother, and you tried to break the one heart that never betrayed me." Kinu dropped to his knees, begging, but the king's hand rose in command. "Take him," he ordered. The guard seized Kinu as he screamed, "I did it for you. For your throne. For the honor of nobles." The king's expression hardened. "No," he said, "you did it for envy. And envy is the poorest honor of all." The court watched in silence as Kinu was dragged away, his cries fading into the distance. When the hall grew quiet again, King Duro turned to Toba, his eyes softening with both shame and pride. "You saved my life twice," he said, his voice breaking. "Once from poison and once from blindness." He placed his trembling hand on Toba's shoulder. "You have shown me that a man's worth is not written in his birth, but in his truth." The courtiers bowed their heads as the king declared before all, "From this day forth, Toba is not my servant, but my royal protector, guardian of this crown and the heart of this throne." The hall erupted in applause, not of ceremony, but of relief and reverence. Toba bowed, tears glimmering in his eyes, and as he rose, sunlight poured through the high windows, spilling across his face like a blessing. For the first time in many days, the kingdom of Duro breathed freely again. But deep in the king's heart, one thought remained, a vow that no lie, no greed, and no man would ever again darken the light of truth that his loyal servant had fought to save. The throne room was quiet that evening, but not in fear. This time it was peace that lingered in the air. The same walls that once echoed with doubt and betrayal now shimmered with a new kind of light. King Duro sat on his throne, weaker in body but stronger in spirit. He looked at Toba standing before him, not as a servant, not as a man wronged by fate, but as a soul who had carried the burden of loyalty through the fire of deceit and come out pure. "Come closer, Toba," the king said, his voice softer than the day's first wind. "I owe you more than life itself. You were the heart I failed to see when the darkness blinded me." The entire court watched as the king rose slowly, his trembling hands lifting a gold medallion, the symbol of the royal protector. He placed it on Toba's neck. The moment felt sacred. Even the guards bowed their heads. "From this day," the king declared, "your word will hold weight equal to mine. For a man who guards truth guards the kingdom itself." Toba lowered his eyes, tears glistening like dew. "My king," he whispered, "I only did what any son would do for the father who raised him." That simple line broke through every heart in the room. The king stepped forward and embraced him. For the first time in years, the people saw their ruler not as a symbol of power, but as a man who could forgive and feel and weep. But peace, as history teaches, never comes without its test. In the following months, Toba's name spread beyond the palace walls. He was loved by the people. Farmers greeted him with respect, soldiers followed his orders with pride, and children ran behind his horse cheering his name. Yet, far away in the corners of the kingdom, whispers stirred again. Lord Kinu's brother, a man named Saren, burned with revenge. He could not bear to see the servant his brother once tried to destroy, now standing higher than any noble. He gathered a band of loyalists, men poisoned by the same jealousy that once consumed Kinu, and plotted to overthrow the king. One fateful night, when the moon hid behind the clouds, they attacked. The palace shook with the sound of metal against metal. But Toba, always vigilant, was already awake. With no armor, no shield, just his courage, he fought side by side with the royal guards. The courtyard turned into a battlefield of loyalty and hate. Flames rose near the stables, arrows cut through the air. In the chaos, Saren lunged at the king, but Toba threw himself in front of him, taking the blade to his shoulder. He didn't fall. He grabbed the sword, twisted it from Saren's hands, and struck him down. Blood on his clothes, fire in his eyes, he looked at the traitors and roared, "No power built on lies will ever rule this land again." Those who lived dropped their weapons, trembling. The rebellion died as quickly as it was born. When dawn came, the palace was quiet once more. The fires were put out, the wounded tended, and the dead buried with honor. King Duro walked through the courtyard and saw Toba sitting near the fountain, his arm bandaged, his eyes lost in the water's reflection. "You could have left me," the king said, sitting beside him. "You could have run, and no one would have blamed you." Toba smiled faintly. "You once told me, Majesty, that the strength of a kingdom is not its gold, but the people who love it. I only did what you taught me." The king placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then the future of this land is safe in your hands." In the years that followed, the kingdom of Duro flourished once more. The story of the servant who saved his king was sung in villages, written on temple walls, and passed from father to son. But for Toba, the true reward was not glory or title. It was the quiet peace of knowing that no matter how deep the shadow, truth always finds its way back to the light. And in that light, the servant and the king, bound not by power, but by faith, became legends that time itself could never erase.